All right. Do we have Apple Store this week? Please, you have at least one Apple Story this week.
I haven't complained about Apple the entire episode. And so
I was afraid we might not have an Apple Story this week. What kind of hijinks are they getting up to this week?
Well, they're a passive participant in this story. So unless you're living under a rock, you've probably heard that the US DOJ has accused Apple of a, quote, broad, sustained, and illegal smartphone monopoly in a new lawsuit. Here's a little quote from an article about it, which we'll link. Quote, the lawsuit filed in federal court in New Jersey alleges that Apple has monopoly power in the smartphone market and uses its control over iPhone to, quote, engage in a broad and sustained illegal course of conduct. The central to the case is whether Apple's strategy of blocking rival companies from accessing various proprietary features, such as iMessage instant messaging service, Siri virtual assistant, constitute anti-competitive practices. The case will also examine whether Apple, making its devices easily integrated with each other, but not with other Apple products, creates an unfair hardware limitation to block competitors from the market. So there are 4 specific anti-competitive actions that are addressed in this case. I'm going to read them to you now. So number 1, blocking innovation for apps in the form of suppressing super apps. 2, diminishing the functionality of non-Apple smartwatches. 3, limiting third-party access to digital wallets. That's the chip in the phone that allows you to use Apple Pay. And then 4, suppressing the functionality of cross-platform messaging, the dreaded green bubble, as you may have heard of from being a human in the last decade. So interestingly, there is nothing. They talk about the App Store in the beginning of the case, but they're not actually bringing anti-competitive actions against the App Store, which is very strange to me. I'm not a law person. I just cosplay one occasionally. But it seems to me that the App Store is actually the central point of Apple's monopoly and where they have undisputed monopoly power and also abuse it.
Well, I would argue the first point here is a direct reference to the App Store. So the suppressing of super apps, that is via the App Store and what is allowed to publish or not publish in the App Store.
True, yes. But it seems to be a specific description of what's going on. Mm-hmm. When in reality, I think the App Store by itself is the broad, most anti-monopolistic thing that Apple is doing.
So like a lot of our coverage with Apple's legal filings that they're involved with, I think this has elements that are really legitimate and should be concerning and looked at. And there's also things that I feel are just kind of blocking technology from being its best. So within the things that are discussed here, I think that we should not expect that corporations have to go out of their way to give equal user experience to products that are in their ecosystem and out of their ecosystem. Like, of course, Apple is going to try to prioritize a seamless experience between different Apple apps across their ecosystem. And I don't think that is reasonable to expect tech companies to put the same sort of R&D and effort into facilitating products that they don't make. So that's the part that I think is kind of worthless in this lawsuit. I think the rest of it is pretty legitimate, though. The putting the limitations on what can be distributed through their platform and having categories of products where Apple-made apps have unfair advantages over the rest. I think this is anti-competitive and absolutely is fair grounds for a legal case. But I am not a legal expert either, so yeah, that's my hot take. I think it's a valid case, but I think parts of it are superfluous.
Yeah, I mean, this will be years in litigation, right? Apple said they're going to argue this all the way to the highest courts. It may land on the Supreme Court. I mean, God forbid that we have the Supreme Court litigating on App Store or something like that. But I mean, I think in broad strokes, this is downstream of Apple's monopolistic behavior on the App Store. And Ben Thompson, who I talk about all the time, is one of my favorite tech analysts, basically talked about because they've been so aggressive on the App Store, they're leaving their flank vulnerable, which is their point of integration. So historically, the AirPods work with the iPhone, which work with your Mac, which work with your Apple Watch, and those are closed ecosystems, and they have preferential behavior. And people like that consumer behavior, right? People buy those products because it's really useful.
Right.
And in general, I think that's there may or may not be a legal case about whether or not that is legal, but that's now what this lawsuit is going after. His argument, which I think is fairly reasonable, is that if Apple was more open on the App Store front, less monopolistic, and hadn't built so much animosity, they wouldn't have exposed their flank, which is their sort of core differentiation, which is their integration. And so I don't know whether or not that's true. It's an interesting thing to think about. My major complaint about Apple is around the App Store. I use Apple Mac products. I like that they're all integrated. I think they work very, very well. I think it's also true that they are using basically their domination over one segment, the phone, to expand into other markets. Smarter people than us will decide whether or not that's anti-monopolistic. The thing that bothers me the most is just the way that they treat apps in the App Store. And I think that's the thing that, whether or not it's this case or some other case, needs to be solved down the line.
Yeah, I largely agree with what you said there, Xander. We work with a lot of and talk to a lot of like developers that are either indie developers or Web3 developers. And it's so common that a game by a smaller team is only available on Android because of one or more reasons that Apple has decided like it's not allowable on iOS. And I think, like we're talking about here, some of those reasons may be more valid than others. But at the end of the day, there's a very tight arm of control over distribution through the App Store. And I do agree that that is kind of their biggest funnel for potential monopolistic practices, whether or not that's the biggest thing being addressed in this lawsuit.
Cool. Well, that's it from my end. Any final thoughts, Warren?
I'm so glad I can stop talking. I'm dying over here. But thank you, everyone, for listening. As always, the podcast was brought to you here by our team at Upptic. Here at Upptic, we help games grow. So we do the work. We provide the technology to monitor and optimize more efficiently than your competition. And we really love it. We love games. So if you're making a cool game and just want to focus on making a cool game, have other people do the work of bringing you the right players efficiently, we're your folks for that. You can reach us through our website. It's upptic.com. It's upptic.com.
Talk soon. See you in Vegas.